I'm not quite sure what my job is here today. And I've talked to Vivek about this at length a couple of times, and I'm not absolutely certain. But the first thing I'd like to know is how many of you here are assistant professors? Okay, and if you're not an assistant professor, you're associate professors, or you're going to be assistant professors. Is that it?
No, we also have full professors.
Full professors here, huh? So how many of you assistant professors are scared about getting to be associate? You can be honest. I'm not going to evaluate you. All right. So my job at UCLA is I'm the interim vice chancellor for academic personnel. And I have a multiplicity of jobs, but probably the most important one is that I am the final arbiter of promotions, all promotions, essentially, all major promotions. And of course, the most important one for everybody here is the assistant to associate professor, because at all universities, that's it. And so I'm just going to briefly go through what the university, how many of you are from the University of California in one campus or another here? Okay, so you might understand some of this. The University of California has probably one of the more complex academic promotion systems in the country. And just to give you a rough idea, it, of course, like every other university, has the 3 ranks: assistant, associate, and full professor. But what we have here are these steps. And the steps make each rank very, very specific as to how you get advanced. So as an assistant professor, you have 4 steps or 8 years to go from assistant to associate professor. And you're reviewed every 2 years for this. And in fact, at your 4th year, you get an appraisal that runs through the whole system, so that you're reviewed by the whole campus. And I'll come back to that. As associate professor, we actually have 3 steps, each one 2 years apart, so you're usually an associate professor for 6 years. But the difference between assistant and associate professor is that if you don't make associate professor in 8 years, you lose your job. Whereas you could sit at associate professor and not go to full professor for as long as you want. You just either you stop getting reviewed every 2 years, and you get reviewed every 5 years. Now the real trick is full professor. At full professor, we have 10 steps, each one 3 years apart. So that comes to 30 years if you go along. So basically, if you can add, I'm not real good at that, it comes to, what is 8 and 6, 14, so that's 34 years or something, or 44 years. So if you figure out you're going to start when you're what? Most of the time you start in your late 20s, something like that. So by the time you're done, you're ready to retire, at least. Okay. So that's the system we have here. But one of the things this does is it sets up all these reviews. There's a trillion reviews. You're reviewed every 2 years, every 2 years, every 2 years, and you're reviewed every 3 years, 3 years, 3 years. So that gets to be kind of a real long-term enterprise. But the question is, and the important thing is, how are you evaluated? So all faculty are evaluated the same way. It doesn't matter whether you're interdisciplinary or single discipline, or whether you're from the arts, or whether you're from the medical school, or whether you're a basic researcher, or you're a writer, or whatever, okay? What the most important thing we look at, and this is UCLA, and it's also probably the whole UC, is that we are a research university. And so it's your creative academic activity and research. So I use the word creative academic activity because in a lot of places on this campus, it's not really research. It's something else. It's they create things. We have 3 performance schools here. The School of Music, the Herb Alpert School of Music, a theater school, and we have an architecture and art school. And you can be sure that when folks in those schools get evaluated, it's not how many publications they have, but it's what they've done. It's a different set of things. And we'll come back to that. It's very, very specific to your discipline, how you get evaluated. Everybody gets evaluated on their teaching, but teaching takes a wide variety of forms. In the college, or up here on what we call North Campus, teaching is classes for the most part. However, on the South Campus, in the medical school, and to a certain extent in the dental school, teaching is mentoring or supervising. And so it gets a little different in terms of the different parts of campus. But everybody has to teach and everybody has to be evaluated for their teaching. And we do it in a multiplicity of ways, which I'm not going to go into. Finally, there's service. Service is a wide swath of categories. The most simple one that everybody thinks about is committee service. You know, that committee for your department, committee for your division, university committees, all that stuff. But there's also lots of other things in service. There's community service. There's service to your professional organizations. There's service to journals. There's service to granting agencies and all that kind of stuff. So service is a wide. And I have a fourth thing down there called contributions to diversity. So on this campus, we are extremely cognizant of issues around diversity. And what we ask is that when you talk about all of the kinds of things that you do and when you're reviewed, that you include how you contributed to issues around diversity. And this is becoming more and more important as we go not only on this campus, but across a whole bunch of other campuses across the country. So we have a very specific promotional system here. And it sounds incredibly complex, but it's really not. All evaluations start out in departments. And departments all do it kind of slightly differently. They're a little idiosyncratic. But essentially, there's usually an ad hoc committee formed in a department. You're asked to put together all your material related to the three things I just said. And then you are evaluated by the ad hoc committee, and then typically the department meets and they discuss you, and then they vote on you, and then that department votes. The chair of the department or an associate chair might write a letter describing what happened in the department. Okay, so that goes to a dean. The dean then kind of does the same thing, only they don't do it in committee. The dean does it by themselves. And some of our actions stop at the dean. Lots of those little step promotions stop. They're simply dean's final. But the big actions, assistant professor to associate professor to full professor, and we have some of these what we call barrier steps here. They go beyond the dean. They go to the committee that Vivek was talking about. It's called the Council on Academic Personnel, or CAP, C-A-P, and it's a 14-member committee, and it's got representation across the whole campus. And it views every one of these cases, and it evaluates every one of these cases, and it votes on the case. It votes either favorable, if it's a majority favorable, or sometimes unfavorable. How many unfavorables have you done this year? You remember?
Not really.
No. There aren't that many unfavorables. I can tell you from my experience, because I see all the outcomes, I would say 90% of the outcomes are favorable. But don't let that fool you that it's still very difficult to get tenure and move up the system. The reason that it's favorable is that the system kind of self-selects, and people who don't do well or are having problems sort of walk away from the system or go to another university. So in a sense, it's not really the fact that most of our people get promoted is really kind of, if you look at percentages, it's not quite accurate. But anyway, these go to the Council on Academic Personnel, and I get the output of the Council on Academic Personnel. And my job is to look at all these reviews. There are essentially three group reviews. There's a departmental review, there's a dean's review, and there's a CAP review. And so I look at all those, and then I make a decision. And 99% of the time, my decision follows the CAP decision. I'm usually pretty much along the lines of what they say. And then if CAP is positive, then I'm positive or favorable. The person gets their promotion. That's kind of the end of it. So that's how it works. Now, I was asked to specifically talk about interdisciplinary research. It turns out I know a lot about interdisciplinary research because that's what essentially I have done for my whole career. I'm not bragging, I have about 250 peer-reviewed journal articles published. Okay? I do not have one peer-reviewed journal article that's single author. Every article I have ever written, it's a multi-author article. And so I know from a lot of personal experience how you can get involved in interdisciplinary research and how you have to be, how you're viewed in it. And that's what I'm going to try to talk about. The first thing that you got to realize is that now with big science, and I'm sure you guys have been heard about it all this week and all before, that it's really encouraged, basically, and that science now is no longer a single investigator working in their laboratory, doing their thing with a graduate student or a postdoc or something like that. Science now is a combination of people working on a project from different perspectives. So you've got to get there. And some of the perspectives are unidisciplinary, but some of them are multidisciplinary, where you have people coming from different places. So the real trick and the most important thing is if you want to convince somebody about what you're doing, you have to specify what exactly your component is in that multidisciplinary organization. And this is especially true when collaboration leads to co-authorship, okay? The most important thing, or one of the most important things, I'm going to come back to that in a minute, is the self-statement. But the other things that work here are letters from chairs that point out what you're doing, what your contribution has been. But more importantly is what I consider annotations to publication. So you all have CVs, right? Right? Okay, so on your CVs, you list your publications, right? Do you list under the publication in a couple of sentences what you did? I don't know. Okay? Well, it's important, okay? Because when your file is looked at by somebody who doesn't know who you are, and they sort of kind of know what you do, they don't know exactly how you've contributed to that publication. So if you annotate it, 2 sentences. And if you do it continuously, it's not a big deal. It's easy to do. Then your contribution is there. Now, look, we all know if you're in these areas, if you're the last author, chances are you're the person who generated the money and the ideas for the project and the publication. If you're the first author, most of the time you're the person who did all the grunt work in the laboratory, collected the data and all that kind of stuff. I mean, that's sort of given in a lot of things. But what's not given is what happens to the 15 people in the middle. What did they do? And so it's really crucial to do that. And so the last thing that I'm going to talk about are the self-statements. So do all of you, when you've been promoted or when you're going for promotion, do you write a self-statement? Yes, okay, good. So the first thing you got to remember about a self-statement is that it's not being written by your colleagues. It's not being read by your colleagues. And it's not necessarily being read by somebody who knows the field that you're in. So if you use a lot of jargon and a lot of terminology that's very specific to your field, you might lose a big proportion of individuals who are supposed to read your statement and evaluate what you've done. So when you explain things, think about, I'm explaining them to my mother, or I'm explaining them to my grandmother. You know, think about that. That's how you want to be able to set this stuff up. It's got to be explanatory so that somebody who doesn't know your field can say, that's interesting. Or, that's important. The other point is important. I have read, I don't know how many self-statements over the years. Some of them, they get into the weeds. You know, they get really down there into the nitty-gritty. Sometimes it's necessary. Most of the time it's not. Most of the time what's really crucial is, what is the impact of your work? What is its importance? How does it fit into a broader context? This is what's really crucial about you explaining yourself. The other thing is, and you know, there's this tendency of pointing out how great you are. Be truthful. Be real. There's nothing wrong with saying, I started this project and it didn't work. And I spent 6 months, 7 months on this project and it didn't work for the following reason. Or we had these problems. There's nothing wrong with telling the truth. In fact, you're more respected if you tell the truth about what you're doing and how you're doing it than if you're always skipping over all that stuff. Now, people evaluating you know how to do science. And they know how to do it whether it's a single or a multidisciplinary process. Okay. The other thing is, and I kind of alluded to it before, is don't spend a lot of time in details. Paint broad pictures. And finally, don't write a book. I have seen self-statements. Now, I review across this whole campus. So the statements I get from the areas that are more scientifically oriented, engineering, the health sciences, the life sciences, they tend to be 3 to 5 pages most of the time. Then I get one from philosophy, and that's 22 pages. Or I had one from somebody in Spanish, one of the languages, and it turned out to be almost 40 pages. You know, there's only so much time you have to read and so much attention that you have when you do this. So try to be brief, try to be concise about what you're doing in the self-statement. But the self-statement is going to define you to your reader. And so you kind of spend a lot of time. A well-crafted self-statement can easily make a case. So I'm going to stop here, and if you have questions, I'm happy to try to answer them.
Let me get the ball rolling, Mike. So, for the longest time, like R01s were supposed to be the lead indicator for madness for going to an associate. But in these funding times, no matter how talented that researcher, it may be difficult to get. So, do you have any suggestions? I mean, the excellence is still there, but they don't have that visible goalpost.
So this has become a major problem, especially in the health sciences, where NIH grants are grants. I mean, it's just not only R01s, it's R21s and R34s, and whatever the other numbers are. I think it's slowly changing in terms of how people are being reviewed. And now, in my mind, it's not so much whether you have an R01 or an R grant, it's can you in fact get funding, or can you in fact join groups that are funded and make important contributions to those groups. And I think that's how, please correct me if I'm mistaken, but that's kind of how CAP is looking at it more and more. Because the proportion of R grants now is less than, or about 10 to 15%. But it's a little bit higher for first-time investigators. It goes up to in the 20s and 25th percentile, depending upon the institutes that you go to. But I think this is an across-the-board issue. But then we're being funded differently now. Now a lot of the funding is these large centers or U grants or things like that. So having components of a grant and being the person who's running a component is just as good as having an R01. So The other thing that I always suggest when it comes to funding, it's like the stock market, diversify. Don't put all your eggs in the NIH or the government basket. Go out there, look for private sources of money. There's nothing wrong with it. Money's money. You know, you can run your laboratory. And I've seen a lot of people be very successful out there in the private sphere or in the philanthropy sphere of getting various organizations to fund. Yeah.
So my department actually has started asking us to annotate on CVs and publications, or at least encouraging it. One of the things that I'm wondering, CVs are still very structured. How, giving you recommendations on what that should look like, because right now it often looks odd.
Well, so there are two ways to do it. One is you keep a CV that you use for whenever you just want your CV, and another is you keep a duplicate where you annotate, and that's the one that you can use when you want to get promoted. I mean, that's just as easy, because the only time it really counts is when you put your file in to get promoted. So you could do that. I've seen people do them in different ways. Usually at UCLA, we ask everybody to submit a CV. And in addition to that, they fill out what we call data summary sheets. And on the data summary sheets, it lists all the publications. So that's where you can annotate it, and then you keep your CV being cleaner. Yeah, well, you're all going to be, what? Is there another question? No? Good.
Yeah.
Okay, good luck.
Wonderful. Thank you, Michael, for coming. We appreciate your wisdom.
Now for the